Chapter 19, The Hunt, Part 3. Let's go back a bit, to the moments immediately after Jinchi and Maomao jumped into the waterfall. She felt firm pressure, first against her mouth, then her chest. Maomao groaned, then coughed up water. She sat up, allowing herself to vomit out whatever would come up, along with remaining contents of her stomach. She felt someone gently rubbing her soaked back. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't swim."
"No one could swim in that,"
Maomao managed, in spite of her bloodless face and lips. Entirely without warning, Jinchi had grabbed her in his arms and flung them both off a cliff. He'd had a proper running start and had kicked hard off the ground. Somewhere in the middle of it, Maomao had thought she heard another blast of the Feifa. The cliffside had been nearly 50 meters high. Under any other circumstances, she could have only assumed that Jinchi had lost his mind. "The basin here is deep," he said now. "So long as you manage to land in it, you should survive, assuming you don't drown."
"Big assumption,"
Maomao replied. When he saw how angry she was, Jinchi found he couldn't quite look at her. Maomao stood and loosened her sash. Her robe was soaked through and very heavy. "What are you doing?"
"I'm sorry I'm not pretty enough for you, but I'll catch a cold at this rate, and so will you. Take off your clothes, Master Jinchi. I'll wring them out."
Then Maomao began to do just that. Her robe was still heavy. Deciding she didn't care that much, Maomao proceeded to pull off her skirt and even her underrobe. There was a thump as bundles of medicinal herbs hit the ground. They were soaked, ruined, she thought, sighing. She decided to refrain from removing the simple clothes that covered her front and her hips at least. There might not be much to hide on her body, but she wanted to hide what there was. She picked up Jinchi's robe, tossed it on the ground with a thump of its own, and began squeezing the water out. "You can worry about mine later," he said. "Take care of yours first." He sounded oddly annoyed. Knowing she couldn't let him stay that way, however, she continued wringing out his robe. He practically snatched it back from her and began squeezing it dry himself. She figured that was just as well. He was stronger than she was and would do it more efficiently. She went back to working on her own clothes. She put her skirt and underrobe, still rather damp, back on, and then finally took a look around. They were in a dim cavern.
"Where are we?"
"Behind the waterfall. Not many people know about this place."
"But you do."
"An official who used to play with me here long ago taught me about it. I gather that going in here is sometimes used as a sort of test of courage."
"I see."
Maomao sifted through the inundated herbs, trying to decide if there was anything that could still be used, when she came upon some small bundles wrapped in bamboo shoot skin coverings. She held them out to Jinchi. He undid the monkey grass that tied the bundle shut to reveal boiled butterbur. They'd been packed in layers, and the ones at the center were relatively undamaged.
"I'm sorry it's such poor fare, but I must ask that you eat this,"
Maomao said. The plant was seasoned to give it some flavor, and a bit of a soaking probably wouldn't hurt the taste that much, but nonetheless, it wasn't the sort of thing one would normally put on a noble's dinner table. "What is it? Some kind of medicine?"
"No, sir. You appear to lack salt."
The butterbur wasn't intended as a medicament. Maomao had brought it along as a snack to munch on in her spare time. The flavoring had appeared at breakfast that morning, and Maomao had liked it, so she'd asked one of the maids to pack some for her. "Salt?" Jinchi asked, looking at Maomao. His mood seemed to have improved, but she couldn't forget how he'd been stumbling earlier. During their leap, she'd dropped the bottle she'd brought to give him. She'd filled it with a mixture of water, soy paste, and sugar.
"When you wear a disguise like that on a day as warm as this, of course you'll start to overheat. I bet you were feeling lethargic and had a headache."
It was clear why Jinchi hadn't been feeling well. He'd gone around with his face covered, not only failing to eat properly, but hardly even getting any water. Even a lack of water alone, though it seemed such a simple thing, could lead to death in some cases. Dunking themselves in the basin had taken the edge off the overheating, but she wanted him to get some salt for good measure. Hence the butterbur. "So that's what you're thinking." Jinchi took some of the plant and put it in his mouth. Then he promptly took another bite. The salty flavor must have been better than he'd expected. At that moment, a rather embarrassing sound echoed through the cavern. It came from Maomao's stomach. It wasn't her fault. Maomao didn't eat much, but that meant she got hungry all the sooner. And the servants didn't eat until after the guests had dined. Jinchi put a hand to his mouth, holding out some of his butterbur to Maomao. She was suddenly seized by the desire to glare at him, to bare her teeth and scowl. She managed to quash the impulse, of course.
"Thank you,"
she said, although she worked in a bit of a pout as she said it, and then plucked a bit of butterbur for herself and put it in her mouth. Defeated, Jinchi ate his helping as well. When they were left with only the wrapping, Jinchi licked the last of the salt off his fingers. Maomao was struck by how childlike it was, but anyway, she went ahead and cleaned up the bamboo wrapper.
"What in the world was that earlier?"
she asked, deeply uneasy. That was a Feifa, a handheld firearm. The shots came fairly close together, so there's a good chance we were attacked by multiple assailants. The Feifa was designed for battle, but using it required packing it with powder and ammunition, then setting fire to it. That presumably explained Jinshi's choice to jump off the cliff rather than to try to hide in the forest. In the woods, he would have been running straight into the enemy's clutches. All the worse when they didn't know how many enemies there were.
What's he done to get himself so hated?
Mama wanted to berate him for dragging her into this, but if she was honest with herself, she could hardly complain. She was the one who'd followed him out to where they made convenient targets. The moment they'd entered the woods, they'd made themselves vulnerable, but getting out of sight of the mountain's residents had been the final nail in their coffin. Notwithstanding her misgivings, Mama looked around at where they were. The roar of the waterfall filled the cavern, which was damp and full of moss. She could see the skeletons of small animals here and there, suggesting that they'd gotten in but hadn't managed to get back out. The cavern was darker farther in, but she could feel a breath of wind.
So you knew about this cavern. Do you know if there's a way to get out? She asked.
Normally, one would simply swim out past the waterfall.
Might be tricky for me.
Mau was not a gifted swimmer. Witness how she had nearly drowned earlier. There's a hole in the ceiling up ahead, Jinchi replied. It's connected to a cave closer to the residence. Those who had entered this cavern as a test of courage had been, it seemed, often extricated via that route.
Does Master Gaoshun know about this place?
Jinchi couldn't quite look at her. He hated for me to play games like this. So they'd been doing it in secret from him. The air between Mau and Jinchi suddenly seemed to grow more tense. Basen knows about it, but I'm not sure if he'll connect the dots immediately. Unlike Gaoshun, Basen wasn't always the quickest thinker. If only there were some way to let him know where they were. Whoever had shot at Jinchi was probably searching the area around the waterfall now, and in Jinshi's current physical state, there were no guarantees he would be able to swim safely away anyway. Mau turned toward the interior of the cave. She could hear the wind whistling through the ceiling. It occurred to her that they might be able to shout for help, but Jinchi shook his head. They would have to be awfully close by to hear us. We'd be lucky if somebody noticed if we shouted all day. Mau cocked her head as a memory floated to mind. She put her thumb and forefinger into her mouth and tried to whistle. But she hadn't done it for a long time, and she didn't get much of a sound.
Should have known it wouldn't be that easy.
Admitting defeat, she went over and looked up at the hole in the ceiling. It wasn't that far up, maybe 270 centimeters. Jinchi had to be at least 180, but he probably wouldn't be able to jump to the hole. Jinchi watched her, seeming to know what she was thinking. He didn't say it, but she assumed he was trying to judge how heavy she was. Mau preempted him.
I can't.
He had probably been picturing her perched on his shoulders and concluding that she might be able to reach the opening. Being who and what she was, however, Mau simply couldn't agree to such a plan. If Suiren ever found out Mau had put her feet on Jinchi, regardless of the exigencies of the situation, Mau didn't want to think what might happen to her. What's the alternative? You underneath? I would crush you.
But
do it. When he put it that way, she didn't have much choice. Mau went over to where Jinchi was crouching down, although she made a point to look annoyed about it. He was ready for her to get on his shoulders, and, left with no other options, she did so. She held on to his damp head as lightly as possible as he stood up. You could stand to put a little weight on, you know.
Surely this isn't the time, sir.
She couldn't see the opening in the gloom, but was able to find it by feel. It was damp and slippery in places. Somehow, she managed to get a grip by the tips of her fingers, then pulled herself up so her feet were on Jinshi's shoulders. Seems promising, he said.
Yeah,
Mau replied. Just as she was preparing to stand up, though, a moist-eyed creature landed square on her head. Ribbit, it croaked, and then jumped away again.
A frog,
Mau thought. It was hardly enough to scare her, but it was plenty to break her concentration. Her fingers, which had barely been holding her up, slipped away.
Oh!
Mau lost her balance, still only halfway to her feet. The motion caught Jinchi below her. Hey, watch out! He exclaimed, wobbling. He could have simply let go, but he had the decency to try to hold on to Mau. Unfortunately, the result was that he slipped on the damp moss and took a tremendous fall. He didn't say anything immediately. Mau, meanwhile, felt no pain, but did find damp skin pressed against her cheek. It was noticeably warm, and she could feel a pulse in it. She also couldn't move. 2 large arms were wrapped around her, holding her close. Vestiges of fragrant perfume reached her nose. Mau felt her own heart rate increase. She worried that with their bodies so close, Jinchi would hear it, but she couldn't pull away, even though she wanted to. As the blood pounded through her veins, Mau Mau found herself focused on just one thing.
What is that?
Mau Mau's left hand was caught between them, and something squishy lay against her palm. At first she thought it was the frog, crushed by the fall, but the size was nothing like that of the amphibian that had jumped on her head. What's more, whatever it was seemed to be covered in cloth. Had the frog jumped into Jinxi's robe? Without really thinking about what she was doing, Mau Mau groped around with her fingers, trying to figure it out. Jinxi grunted. His heart rate shot up. Mau Mau looked up to find herself staring at Jinxi's chin. She could see him biting his lip, hard. He seemed to be struggling, fighting with something. The frog in his robe shifted, as if it were alive. I'm sorry, but could you move your hand? It's making things rather difficult. Jinxi sounded like he could barely get the words out, and he refused to look at her. She even saw that for some reason, cold sweat was trickling down his face. His brow was firmly knitted, almost as if he were in great pain.
Difficult?
Mau Mau reflexively squeezed her hand, and Jinxi's expression grew dramatically more intense. Only then did it occur to Mau Mau to look at where her hand actually was. It rested somewhere below Jinxi's belly button. She didn't say anything. Something was there. Something that should never have been there. Something that would be hugely embarrassing to have grabbed, yet which she shouldn't have been able to grab because it shouldn't have been there. It categorically couldn't have been there. Jinxi was a eunuch, an official of the rear palace. But, well, what was there was there. Huh? Slowly Mau Mau moved her hand away and was about to try to extricate herself from Jinxi's slackened grip, but he pressed on the small of her back, keeping her where she was, straddling him. Jinxi brushed his bangs aside and let out a breath, then looked at Mau Mau. I suppose, in a sense, this saves me some trouble. His face was that of a celestial nymph whose heart was beset by gloom. But he was no nymph. He had a countenance that could have brought the country to its knees with a single smile, yet he was no woman. And neither, it turned out, was he a eunuch bereft of the foremost symbol of manhood. Jinxi's robe had come open when Mau Mau had landed on him, but the body it revealed was not soft and indulged. Instead, it was all taut muscle, the product of discipline and training. His face might be that of a nymph, but his body was that of a warrior. Now it seemed inexplicable to Mau Mau that it had never occurred to her before that he might not be a eunuch. Perhaps she'd subconsciously avoided entertaining the possibility. There's something I want to tell you, Jinxi said. It's one reason I had you come along on this trip. Mau Mau found herself wanting to plug her ears. She understood instantly that she mustn't hear any more. But plugging her ears would only make it obvious what she was thinking. There was a man in the rear palace who wasn't a eunuch. What would happen if that fact got out? What if that man had ever laid a hand on any of the consorts? If seed that wasn't the emperor's had been sown in his garden? Mau Mau scowled at Jinxi.
Stop, please. Don't drag me into this.
Jinxi had frequently put Mau Mau to use before, and although sometimes more and sometimes less, it was always a headache for her. Even so, it had never seemed worth her while to get truly upset. But this was different. Once she had this knowledge, she would have to take it to her grave.
And I'm not ready to follow you to my grave.
Thus instead, Mau Mau said,
I'm very sorry, sir. I'm afraid I might have crushed a frog.
She kept her face completely expressionless. A frog. Jinxi winced. Fine, let him wince. Mau Mau would overcome this situation by sheer force of will.
Yes, sir, a frog. I apologize again. It dropped on me from above and made me lose my balance. You aren't hurt, are you?
That squishy feeling thing had been a frog, she kept telling herself. Just a frog. That was no
I'm terribly sorry. I know you took the brunt of the fall for me. Let's get out of here, quickly.
She tried to stand up, but Jinxi wouldn't let go of her.
Master Jinxi, could you move your hands?
Who were you calling a frog? Jinxi sat up, still holding her in place, so that they ended up facing each other, with Mau Mau almost on his knees. What with his legs spread and her veritably on top of him, the situation could hardly have looked more compromising. As Jinxi leaned closer to her, Mau Mau almost flinched away, but she was not going to be beaten now. She stared him down, their noses inches apart.
If it wasn't a frog, what was it? She asked.
It was just a frog, it was just a frog, she kept repeating, like a mantra. The squishy thing under her left hand had been a frog. A frog, and nothing more. Frogs were gross. She wiped her hand on her skirt. Surely a frog would have been smaller, wouldn't it? Jinchi asked, getting his face another inch closer to hers.
No, sir. There are some decently sized amphibians around this time of year.
Decent? Jinchi flinched again, looking shocked, and Mau seized the moment to close the distance further, until their noses were practically touching.
Yes, decent. And if it wasn't a decently sized frog, what decently sized thing could it have been?
Decently sized didn't cover it, but that would do for now. Yes, decently sized would be enough. Hey, are you wiping your hand? Why did Jinchi seem so scandalized?
Because frogs are gross, sir.
Gross? This from the person who drinks snake wine?
But frogs are slimy.
Who's slimy? They glared at each other for long seconds, then almost a minute. Jinchi blinked first, so to speak, looking away from Mau with his lips still pursed.
Did I win?
Mau asked herself with a sigh of relief. No good ever came of knowing too much. And for Mau, whose birth made her suited for little more than drudge work, it was best not to know anything at all. Then whatever happened, whatever her superiors might do, Mau could say truthfully that she hadn't known anything about it. That had been her position thus far, and she had no intention of changing it now. Jinchi and Mau were an official and his servant. Nothing more, nothing less, and she need know no secrets to fulfill her duties. Jinchi's grip finally relaxed, and Mau slithered out and tried to stand up, only to find herself pushed to the ground. She hadn't been expecting it, and she collapsed, falling on her back. She looked down, and there was Jinchi. He shifted, crawling on top of her. A faint light, like a candle flame, danced in his eyes. Very well. He slowly set his hands behind her knees and lifted them up, putting the two of them in an even more compromising position than before. Want to find out for yourself? Jinchi was scowling. Mau got goosebumps all over and started sweating profusely. She realized belatedly that she'd pushed Jinchi too far. Jinchi, for his part, looked lost for a beat. Seconds, then a minute passed, and neither of them moved. At length, Jinchi seemed to make a decision. He bit his lip and leaned forward, his face slowly coming closer to hers.
I wonder if I should give him a good kick,
Mau thought, her mind whirling, but then Jinchi stopped and looked up in annoyance. What's that? Mau thought she heard a noise from the exit. What sounded like the howling of an animal could be heard from above them. Slowly, uncertainly, Mau put her fingers in her mouth and whistled. She was answered by the barking of a dog. She whistled again, and there a ball of fur came plunging through the hole above them, landing square on Jinchi's back. While he rubbed his waist, Mau scrambled out from under him. The fur ball was the hunting dog Lihaku had been playing with. Mau gave it a big hug and a nice pat. Hey, what are you doing? Don't go running off like that, came the voice of the other big dog. He didn't sound terribly worried, really. Still rubbing his back, Jinchi looked up at the ceiling. Mau, feeling like she'd escaped by the skin of her teeth, shouted Lihaku's name as loud as she could. How in the world did you get down there? Lihaku asked, looking flummoxed. He'd fetched a rope and pulled Mau and Jinchi out of the cavern. As Jinchi had said, the hole in the ceiling led out close to the residence. And what are you doing with someone so important? He added in a whisper to Mau. Someone so important seemed to refer to Jinchi, who was now wearing his disguise. Presumably it would have been safe for Lihaku to see him, but then perhaps one couldn't be too careful.
Let's just say it's hard to explain, she said.
Lihaku cocked his head at that, but with someone of Jinchi's status involved, he knew it was best not to ask too many questions. They told him only that they'd fallen into the waterfall basin and ended up in the cave. I must ask you not to tell anyone that I'm here, Jinchi said. He was seated on the floor of the upper cavern. He sounded like a different person from usual. Maybe it was just that hard to speak with a mask on. As you wish, sir. Lihaku bowed his head respectfully. Maybe Jinchi wanted to see what the others would do next if they didn't realize he'd been found. Mau was surprised, though, that he wasn't going to let Bosun or even Gaoxuan know. The dog was lying in Lihaku's lap, wagging its tail. He was patting its head and giving it pieces of dried meat. Mau glanced at the animal. It had managed to follow her whistling, so it obviously had pretty good ears.
Does he know any other tricks? She asked.
Tricks? He can find a rabbit warren, I guess. That's about it. It was like she and Lihaku were having a perfectly normal conversation. The dog came over and sniffed her. There was an intelligence behind the goofy demeanor. Mau stole a glance at Jinchi. With what had just happened, she almost couldn't bring herself to look him in the eye. But what had to be said, had to be said.
Master
Kosen, she began, remembering just in time to use his assumed name. Since he was wearing the mask, he probably wanted to go by his pseudonym. Yes, what is it? The voice that came from behind the mask was cold. He must have been angry at Mau Mau for getting him so worked up earlier. Why else would he be acting like this? And would it be unfair of Mau Mau to claim that she'd never seen it coming? It wasn't exactly as if he'd tried to deceive her. He might even have been trying to explain himself. But Mau Mau, flooded with a desire not to know anything, had come up with an outrageous cover. She could hardly blame him for being upset about that particular story. He had such confidence in his appearance, after all, and such a fine frog, no doubt. Mau Mau was at a loss for the right thing to do, but if nothing else, she had to start by saying this.
I think I may be able to pinpoint who shot at us earlier.
She gave the hunting dog a pat on the head. And that brings us back to the present. Mau Mau opened the dirty bundle. Inside were 3 Feifa, still redolent of firepower. She had never seen a Feifa before, and was surprised by how small they were. Jinchi and Lihaku looked almost as startled as she had. They were supposedly the newest model, imported from abroad, not yet common in this country. They didn't use a fuse to light the fire powder, like earlier models, but rather relied on a sophisticated construction that used a specially shaped metal part to create a spark to ignite the powder. Neither Jinchi nor Lihaku had ever seen these most up-to-date Feifa. They'd simply fired them once, and their understanding of how the weapons worked went no further than that. These newest Feifa had a unique odor, akin to rotten eggs. Not pleasant by any means. The fire powder was typically made by combining charcoal with saltpeter and sulfur, so that when it exploded, it had a very unique smell. A powerful aroma that made you want to cover your nose. If such a device had been used during the hunt, any dogs, with their excellent noses, would have reacted immediately. And indeed, when presented with a smell, Lihaku's hound had led them directly to these Feifa. Hunts were not conducted with Feifa in this area. For one thing, the guns weren't accurate enough, and they weren't suited to the mountain environment, with all the objects that could get in the way of a shot. The reason they'd been used in the attempt on Jinchi's life probably had much to do with the fact that these were the newest model. The unique way of generating a spark increased their accuracy and range, as their test firing demonstrated, and yet even so, this man who had shot at Jinchi had missed. Lihaku, just that good at his job, had the man's arms pinned behind his back and had put a gag in his mouth to prevent him from swallowing his tongue. I do feel a bit bad for making everyone suspicious of those old guys, Lihaku said. Any trap required bait. At Jinchi's instruction, they'd chosen an official whose reaction was likely to be easy to read. The captive man's co-conspirators, which is to say the officials above him and the lackeys below him, were already being staked out so that they could be arrested at will. Now all that was necessary was to march this man away and get his confession. The hunting dog was running in circles around Lihaku. That's right, you're a good boy, Lihaku said, holding onto the captive with one hand and patting the dog with the other. They already had a pretty good idea of who the culprit was. Anyone who had fired the Feifa would reek of it, and even if they thought they'd gotten rid of the smell, they couldn't fool a tracking dog. Mau Mau wrapped the weapons back up and followed Lihaku as he pushed the captive along.